I mean, on your migration west-east story, I wonder whether you took somehow into consideration that many women from East Germany moved to the West. I mean, showing a much more flexible social mobility. I mean, the classical story about the men left behind, who are also the voters for the far right, is feeling kind of being, left behind. Whether this played a role, because I can imagine from the other side, it's rather more men. I know that you probably took both, but I think this might be part of an explanation of this whole thing. And then I have one question for Anja. When you talked about transnational people, in fact, this is a rather recent term in migration studies coming from the 90s. At the time when you were speaking, in fact, there was another name which was cosmopolitan, in a way being people multilingual at home in several places. I mean, Amos Oz once called them the first Europeans. And then later cosmopolitans got a very bad name from the Nazis, and it gained again then something very positive, being open, liberal, at ease in several places. So why don't you use this for this period? So to start with.
Yeah, thanks. That's a very relevant point, the gender aspect, because we know that gender predicts wealth. We did include it in the model, so it is part of our findings. But as a next step, we're actually working on the question whether the findings differ depending on gender. And yeah, so far the losses are much higher for men than for women. So there are some interesting patterns in there. It's not part of the story, but actually an idea for next paper. Thanks.
Thank you. Thank you for this question. So cosmopolitans and cosmopolitanism got bad rap not only from the Nazis, but also from the Soviets. In fact, after the Second World War, ruthless cosmopolitans in Soviet official parlance basically became the term, that said Jewish. I don't use this term because even though it has many of the same connotations, it's not used in sociological research, and I think it's somewhat imprecise. It's open to interpretation. I mean, I like it emotionally, but I think in research, I have to kind of stick to the accepted definitions. Transnational is used in application to Jewish history, including to interwar Jewish history. Rebecca Kobrin has a book on Bialystok, or rather on the Bialystok diaspora in America between the wars and also post the Second World War. And in the introduction, she uses that concept very aptly, in relation to the Bialystok diaspora in the States, saying how, talking about how people went back to Poland, back and forth, and sent money back and so on. So I think there is a precedent in using the term, when speaking about, Jewish migration in interwar Europe. I think a more difficult question would be, and kind of a more difficult intervention would be to say, transnational really was introduced as a term to define diaspora in the world very much defined by digital communications. So obviously, people exchanged letters, and there was the telegraph in 1920s. At the same time, communication was not instant. So how about that? Nina Glick-Schiller, when she introduced the term, didn't mean for it to, be used retroactively. And yet we're doing that. So I'll figure it out. I'm very, very fascinated by this whole story of German intellectuals, generally Western intellectuals, but specifically German intellectuals, visiting the Soviet Union, writing about the Soviet Union, staying in the Soviet Union, dying in the Soviet Union, which was predominantly the cause, as happened also with Sophie Kupers. Her husband died from TB in 1941, and she was actually sent to Novosibirsk, in 1943, and then she died in the 1970s. But she was only able to visit Germany, Eastern Germany, once after the Second World War. I'm not specifically looking at this group of people as part of my PhD research, because I think this will take me too far away. There are too many things I want to do, and I need to write this one thing, and then I'll do all the other things that interest me. I think the problem also is that, unlike with people who traveled westwards, I cannot really rely on the quality of archival information that I have about people who traveled eastwards. So first of all, let's set aside the problem with Russian archives today. I'm unwilling to travel to Russia these days. It's not coincidental that the Lisitsky archive ended up in the West. I'm basically trying to rely on archives that I can find, in Germany, Israel, the US, Western countries for my PhD research. Generally, people, intellectuals primarily, who traveled to the Soviet Union were already limited in how they could express themselves, even when they moved willingly. They knew what was expected of them. And I don't know exactly where that red line was between what they wanted to write as opposed to what they had to keep to themselves. I'm motivated to look into it, but I don't quite know what they were allowed to say and what not. And so I think archival documentation and the diaries and correspondence and whatnot might be self-censored. And so there was just less to work with. But it's a very fascinating phenomenon. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks for your points. They were, definitely relevant. And actually, it was what motivated our research. Was the question: does it pay off to have moved from the west to the east? Because the other way around, it's quite obvious. And well, according to our findings, actually, that's not the case. I mean, there are examples of people that have a high occupation and a prestigious job in the East and migrated because of that. But we see on average, based on this large scale representative data, people are doing better than those that were already born in the East. So there's some benefit compared to them, but still they're doing far worse than how they would have done had they stayed in West Germany. So it depends on the comparison if you say it worked out or not. Yes, but all in all, the benefits in the West were still much larger than in the East, even in 2017, which is the time when the data was collected. What was the first question? Sorry. So unfortunately, we don't have the information on where people were in between. That's what I said. We just know where they were born and where they are at the time of the data collection. So we don't know about how this contributed to the wealth differences, but we do observe that this at least hadn't that dramatic impact that the East does, or like it didn't really level the field to the extent that the differences would not be observable anymore.
Okay, I mean the shortest answer would be it hasn't changed that much. That's generally true for Adorno. I think he's not. People always think of him as someone who was very influenced by the horrors of Nazi Germany and all that, which is true to some extent, but his basic thinking has not changed all that much. And I didn't really go into that, but he has worked on this essay on Kafka for a long time, so it's hard to say which thought came at which point. And also Minima Moralia, it appeared in 51, but he worked on that in the 40s. So it's really more or less the same period.
Okay, so I'll just address the last question because maybe I can disambiguate. Germany was very limited by the Versailles agreements that ended the First World War as to what it could do in terms of developing its military, or at least maintaining its military, and in terms of trade and commercial exchange. So it needed international partners, and it wanted to rebuild its military after the First World War. With Soviet Russia's help, they could do it. Soviet Russia and Weimar Germany cooperated very closely on rebuilding German military strength in 1920s. Training German pilots in the Soviet Union and so on. And the Soviet Union was not recognized by almost anyone at the international stage till later in 1920s. If I'm not mistaken, I might be mistaken, but I think the Rapallo Accords that extended diplomatic recognition to the Soviet Union, I think it was the first such agreement signed with a foreign country by the Soviet Union. So we can talk during the break. I'll stop there. I'm sorry, what was your question? I forgot it. Yes. So I think in 1920s, Soviet cultural policy was still not monolithic, and these cultural producers had some say as to where they wanted to be and what they wanted to do. They had definitely more agency than, cultural producers during the later times. And so yes, just like El Lisitsky, who lived not only in Germany, but also, he had exhibitions in the Netherlands and in Paris. His friend Elia Ehrenburg was also based in Paris most of the time. Others, like David Bergelsson, the Yiddish writer, was based in Berlin only. So yes, I think Moscow was open to people moving around up to a point, and it happened. Maybe on a mass scale, but it happened to a number of people.